By way of introduction, we are going to kind of just recap where we've been. And so for some of us, this is going to be something that you've heard many, many times. For others, it might be the first time. And so I think spaced repetition is very important. We have very forgetful minds, and we need to be reminded. And I do want to encourage you that if you haven't yet joined our Bible reading plan, or maybe perhaps you've fallen behind, please just go ahead and jump in where we're at. You can find the link on our website. Just join the day where we're at and just start reading along. We're going through the Bible this year in 2020 together as a church family, and we've called the series Finding Our Place in God's Story. We've really been taking a specific focus on the meta-narrative of the overarching story of the Bible and how it all fits together and how our lives fit into that story. And so, we are beginning a new section of this series, this year-long series today. And just by way of review, this is kind of the schedule, if you will, or kind of the flow of what we're doing this year. And as you might remember, the last 6 months or so, we've gone through what we call the Old Testament, but we kind of went through it on Sundays in more of the order of the Hebrew scriptures, the way that they're ordered and arranged, called the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. And now, after finishing up the writings and spending some time in the writings, we're going to move into the gospel writings, which is the beginning of what we call the New Testament or the New Covenant. And so it's really cool that we're reading through the Bible this year together through our app, and we're able to engage and comment. And thank you so much for everybody that is commenting and sharing their thoughts as we're reading God's word together. And for some of us, we're going through the Bible for the very first time all the way through, which is a really incredible thing. And so the way, though, that we arrange Sundays doesn't totally overlap with the order that we're reading the Bible in, because we're reading it in the Protestant canonical order, the way that most of our Bibles are ordered, Genesis to Revelation. But on Sundays, we've kind of shot to have a high-level overview, a 30,000-foot flyover, as I like to say, and look at it maybe through a different arrangement or a different lens, one that helps us to see a larger grand story and how all the pieces and all the books of the Bible fit into that story. So here, in between, as you see, the Ketuvim or the Hebrew writings and to the Gospels, there is a lapse of time. And actually, the way that our Old Testament is arranged, we have the prophets that are last, and in particular, what we call the minor prophets, and that ends with Malachi, which most people believe probably was one of the last books written in the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament, in the canon of the Old Testament. And so during this period between Malachi and when the first writings of the New Testament show up, or Jesus's birth and his life, you have a span of about 400 years. This 400 years is often called the Intertestamental Period, meaning the period of time between the two testaments. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the silent years, because there were no prophetic words from God during this time, and no canonical books of the Bible were written. Canonical just means a part of the canon, a part of the recognized body of work that is inspired by God traditionally. And so it's during this time, it's during this intertestamental period, around the 200s BC, that the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, are actually translated into Greek. So at this point on the world stage, Alexander the Great has conquered the known world and expanded his empire beyond any empire before his time. And so Greek and Greek culture and Greek language becomes the common language for many, many peoples, and at least a secondary language. And so the Old Testament for the Jews is translated into Greek, and it becomes what's known as the Septuagint. The Septuagint is just the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. This would have been the Bible that Jesus was most familiar with. This would have been his scriptures. He was most likely reading from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. And so it becomes the primary text for the Jews that are in what's called the diaspora or the Great Dispersion. So the Jews have been conquered, they're dispersed, they're no longer a centralized nation of Israel in a geographic location. The Jews have been scattered all over, and it's called the Great Diaspora, the Great Dispersion. And this has significant implications and ramifications on the faith and the faith story of the Jews. And this is this is part of the landscape culturally that Jesus then steps onto the scene, that we have the gospel writings. And so for the next couple of months, we're going to spend time in the gospel writings. We're not going to actually read any of the gospels today. I'm not going to dive into any particular text. This is just by way of introduction. We're going to introduce this part of the story, what I call the gospels part, or the Jesus part of the story. And then we're going to end with some time for discussion and Q&A, and just some time to process together what this section means in the overarching meta-narrative of the scriptures. So one of the most significant storylines in the New Testament is a redefinition of what the people of God are. In the Old Testament, God's people are by and large identified by their descent from Abraham, the people of Israel. But in the New Testament, beginning in the Gospels, these writings announce a new and revolutionary step in this direction, that God's people are now defined by their relationship to the Christ, the descendant of Abraham. And a new covenant is being inaugurated. It's being started through the redemption by Christ and sealed by the pouring out of God's Spirit with this new power on all his people, in particular that the prophets of the Hebrew writings talked a lot about. Prophets like Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, these prophets talked about this new day when hearts of stone would be removed and replaced with hearts of flesh, when the laws would no longer be written on tablets of stone, i.e. the Mosaic law, but written on the tablets of one's heart. So the prophets foresaw, God foretold for centuries of this new day when Israel would be redefined, when God's people would be redefined, and it had something to do with the Spirit and the Messiah, the Christ. And so the two Testament formats of our Bible, most of us have, this is what's called a Protestant Bible, and the order and the way that it's arranged in our Bible, it reflects the contrast between promise in the Old Testament and fulfillment in the New Testament. And this is a central storyline of the Bible, promise and fulfillment. So the word gospel, many of us know this, but the word gospel reflects a Greek word meaning good news or momentous news. And so when Christians used this word in Greek in the early first century, when they referred to the good news, they never referred to the gospel books that we have, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That wasn't the gospel or the gospels to them. That was a word that simply meant to reflect the news about Jesus, the message about Jesus, that God had accomplished and done all that he had promised to do to reconcile guilty humans to himself, to powerfully transform them by his Spirit in anticipation of their resurrection existence in a new heaven and a new earth. So when the early Christians referred to gospel, this is what they referred to. They referred to a message. They referred to a story. They referred to a concept that God had accomplished and fulfilled all that he had promised. And so Matthew, Mark, and Luke, those three, what we call three gospels, those three books, those three writings about this message, about this Christ, about this man Jesus, and in particular his ministry and death and resurrection. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are what are called the Synoptic Gospels. If you're not familiar with that term, syn, S-Y-N, just means together with, and optic means seeing. So synoptic means seeing together. And so they're called the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because these three books present Jesus in a very similar way to one another. They often include the same material. They often share the same kinds of vocabulary. They frequently relate incidents of Jesus' life in the same order. But by contrast, you have the Gospel of John, and it's rather different than the Synoptic Gospels. And even just a cursory first glance reading of these 4 books, you start to see that John does kind of protrude out from the other 3 quite a bit. And it's different in its use of words and some of the material that's covered, its vocabulary. John's gospel vocabulary is more limited. He writes of no parables, no exorcisms, no demons being casted out. Obviously, there are some points in common among all 4 of the writings, such as, all of them actually account for the feeding of the 5,000. But though these 4 books of the gospel, though they all convey theological truths, they are also historical books. They're historical writings, and the aim to give readers a historical and theological account of the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And this is important as we're trying to sort of like elevate a bit to find our place in God's story, to look at the meta-narrative of the Bible as a whole, the storyline of the Bible. It's important to remember what the purpose of these books are. The purpose of these books are to reveal the historical reality of a man coming to fulfill all of God's promises. And that through his life, death, and his triumph over death through the resurrection into the new body, he gives a covenant, a new promise to people who will put their faith in him to become God's people, to share in that resurrected, restored Garden of Eden paradise that was lost in the first couple of pages of the story. And so as we continue on here, I want to take a look at this video. You guys know I'm a big fan of Bible Project. I think they're very helpful. If you get tired of the Bible Project videos, I'm sorry, but please stay engaged. I do believe they can be very helpful. This particular video is about how to read the Gospels. How should we as modern day readers take a look at this kind of literature?
There are 4 books in the Bible that are ancient biographies of Jesus. The Gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
And while individual stories about Jesus and his teachings are familiar to many people, these books have way more to offer if we read them from beginning to end and see how they connect Jesus' story into the overall biblical storyline.
So let's talk about how to read the Gospel. First of all, this word gospel, what does it mean?
Well, it means good news.
Which raises the question, good news about what?
Well, in Mark's Gospel, Jesus enters the story announcing that the time is fulfilled. God's kingdom has come near, so turn around and trust this good news.
So the good news is about God's kingdom arriving, but what does that mean?
Well, it's Jesus' way of summarizing the whole biblical story that leads up to himself.
The whole story. Okay, give me the short version.
Well, the story begins with God creating a good world and then appointing humanity as his representatives to rule it. But then the humans rebel over and over, leading to a world of violence and death.
That's a problem.
But God's committed to making it work. So he chooses Abraham and his family to restart the project. Then through Moses, God brings the family into a garden land of abundance so that he can restore all of the nations through them.
Right, Israel becomes a kingdom with amazing kings like David, but eventually Israel rebels too, and it leads them into destruction.
But Israel's prophets said that God wasn't giving up. He was going to personally come and restore Israel so that his justice and peace could spread to all nations and to all creation. This hope was called the kingdom of God.
And that's what Jesus said he was bringing to Israel.
Yes, Jesus' good news is about God's kingdom, the new creation that was arriving to restore humanity to their role as God's partners in ruling the world. This is why the gospel has so many stories about Jesus liberating people from death and disease, along with all of his teachings about generosity to the poor or forgiveness and loving your enemies.
He was inviting people to live in God's new world.
Exactly. And so this is one of the main goals of the gospel, to show how Jesus is bringing the whole biblical story to its fulfillment.
So that's why the gospel authors are constantly appealing to the Hebrew scriptures while telling the story of Jesus.
Yeah, like when Jesus is born in Bethlehem, Matthew reminds us that this was anticipated by the prophet Micah.
And he directly quotes from Micah.
Yeah, these direct quotes are really common. But more often, the gospel authors weave biblical phrases into the story without telling you, so you can discover it for yourself. Like when Jesus is baptized and God announces from the skies,
"You are my son, my beloved. With you I am well pleased."
Now, if you do some digging, you'll find that God's statement blends together phrases from 3 biblical texts to identify Jesus as the royal son of David, the seed of Abraham, and the servant who's going to suffer for the sins of his people.
Whoa, that is subtle.
Yes, and the gospel accounts do this on every page. Every book is constantly showing how all of the biblical stories about Abraham or Moses and David and all the prophets, all of it points forward to Jesus.
Now, why are there 4 different accounts? Wouldn't one be enough?
Well, the diversity is on purpose. Each of the 4 gospel authors has shaped and arranged their stories about Jesus differently, so they can emphasize different things about him. Matthew presents Jesus as a greater Moses, and so he's grouped Jesus' teachings into 5 large blocks, just like the 5 books of the Torah. Luke highlights how Jesus is God's royal servant from the book of Isaiah, who brings God's light to the nations. Mark presents Jesus as a new start for humanity, bringing the mystery of God's new creation crashing into the present. And John focuses on Jesus' claim to be Yahweh, the God of Israel, become human, to do for us what we could never do for ourselves.
Those are really different from each other, but they all tell the same basic story. A man from the region of Galilee teaching this good news, but who's ultimately crucified as a criminal.
Yes, all 4 books of the gospel are showing how the arrival of God's kingdom through Jesus led him up to the cross, where he was enthroned as the king of God's new world.
He's given a robe, a crown, and a scepter.
Right. And as Jesus suffers the consequences of humanity's rebellion, he's showing that the power of God's kingdom comes through his love and self-sacrifice. And when he's raised from the dead, we're watching the dawn of the new creation.
So the gospel authors don't just want their readers to know about the good news of God's kingdom. They want them to become a part of it.
Yes, the gospel is designed to persuade us to trust and follow Jesus so that we can participate in the new creation that he began.